As a millennial, I took it upon myself to try to evaluate what's so wrong with our generation and why they're so mad at us. And then I pretty much realized that we're just existing. We're not really contributing anything to society.
Exactly in what area of technology are you proficient?
Snapchat, Pinterest, Instagram, Vine, Twitter, you know, the big ones.
Millennials crave things like instant gratification, authentic experiences, and for some reason we haven't figured out yet, improv comedy.
Some kids got participation medals. You got a medal for coming in last.
I don't understand
What don't you understand?
what you just said.
You don't understand. You ready to go?
No. You said 8, right?
Yes.
It's as if they're standing at the foot of a mountain and they have this abstract concept called impact that they want to have in the world, which is the summit. What they don't see is the mountain.
Chet, what did the market research turn up?
What? Oh, I googled them, but the results were weird.
People are quite happy now, the youngsters, just to sit and look at a screen.
They'll never really find deep fulfillment in work or in life. They'll just
I mean, of course we've gotten soft as a culture in the U.S.
Fine.
Because
how's your job?
Snapchat.
the U.S. has had an
Here's
incredible
another who
200
single-handedly
How's
started
your
the
relationship? Just
hashtag
fine.
that canceled
So
12
that's
network
the
TV
best
shows.
case.
She
I
found
can't
the
Seems like it was a long list of all the nasty things that your generation does to other people.
Let's talk the generation gap and millennial hate. Late last week, the chairwoman of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Buttrose, spoke to the Australian United Kingdom Chamber of Commerce and said, "It seems to me that today's younger workers, they need much more reassurance and they need to be thanked, which is something many companies don't do. They're very keen on being thanked and they almost need hugging. That's before COVID, of course. Can't hug anymore. But they almost need hugging." You have to understand that they seem to lack the resilience that I remember from my younger days. The 78-year-old millionaire media mogul seemingly believing that things were better in her days when bosses would abuse staff regularly. Well, this isn't an uncommon viewpoint in the media. You often see young people being blasted by their elders for not living up to the expectations set. And that's all too common a sight if you watch YouTube videos, read traditional media, watch the news, watch, TED Talks. But let's put a pin in the specifics of the haters, as it were, and let's take a look back at why we divide groups of people by age. So let's talk the generation gap. The theory of generations was posed by sociologist Karl Mannheim in his 1928 essay Das Problem der Generieren. 10 points for working out what that means in English by yourself at home. The key idea is that the most significant influence on people is the socio-historical environment of their youth, in particular, the notable events that actively include them. This gives rise to social cohorts that, on the basis of shared experience, turn and influence events that shape the next generation, and so on, and so on. The theory of generations, even with its limited scope, and thoroughly Western cultural influence, is incredibly useful for defining how generations are, well, defined. A cohort distinguished by a sense of cultural understanding derived from shared experience over a set period of time. Mannheim notes that within these groups there is internal stratification, i.e. race, class, sex, location, and that will change how people, experience these shared events, and those effects present in the population, but he is quick to cover that whether a person within a group is affected positively, negatively, or neutrally is unimportant. The important thing is that they are included and retain the shared experience. The group is not homogeneous, and thus their views are not homogeneous. Mannheim's theory of generations has been used to explain the force of social change within societies since its inception. The theory has been used to explain how the Nazi generation initially struggled to accept West German democracy, how public support for gay marriage in the United States went from 11% in 1988 to 58% in 2013, a jump of only 25 years, and how Mao's Cultural Revolution directly led to the events leading up to and the protests at Tiananmen Square. Now, the distinguishing terms we use for generations, again, in the Western parlance, are very well known. You know, silent generation, baby boomer, Gen X, millennial, Gen Z. These are the terms which have received the most academic support in recent times. Although you will see millennials being referred to as Gen Y if you go back in the academic record, and boomer and zoomer have become slang internet parlance for baby boomers and Gen Z. That's almost become accepted parlance outside of the internet so much that they're being used. The years that each of these represent also becomes more certain the further away we get from them in time. And as such, the beginning and end dates for the eldest in our community, those above their 40s, are fairly set in stone. But say millennials and Gen Z, it becomes a little more blurred. Say, for the end of the millennial generation and the start of Gen Z, Pew Research uses 1996, my birth year, as their cut-off date, while McCrindle Research in Australia uses 1995, as does Ipsos Mori polling, whilst the US Census Bureau used 2000 as its cut-off date, as late as the year 2015. The interesting thing is that each of these studies use very similar historical events and Mannheim's theory of generations to come to differing conclusions. The big events that define the common millennial experience are 9/11, specifically the memories one has of the date, the Great Recession, and the switch from analog to digital technology and the internet boom that followed. Using my anecdotal personal experience as an example, so, you know, grains of salt, I have no memories of 9/11, but I am keenly aware of its effects on society. My memories of the Great Recession are drawn from watching it on the news as an 11-year-old, and my house had dial-up internet until 2006. With that in mind, I'm fairly clearly a key Gen Z candidate, but I've always felt far more connected to millennials. But I think there's a good reason for that. So let's talk how millennials are portrayed in media.
Right on. Sup, I'm Hammer. First, I'd like to not thank you for hiring me because I just expect good things to happen to me without working for them. Second, I'd like to give you all a list of my trigger warnings.
Now, anyone watching, regardless of age, has seen a news article, a TV show, a comedian, an inspirational talk, or speech where someone is making a wide-reaching generalization about millennials. Although, when they say that, they often are just using it as a catch-all term for young people, which is why I feel I'm connected to the millennial generation. Paper still calls young people millennials, even though people under the age of 24 are pretty clearly Gen Z at this point. So, like Ida from the start, the narrative seems to be that the generation are lazy, self-entitled, need coddling, self-absorbed, vain, and destroying countless industries, and even some careers. But sometimes this reporting, and many of the jokes made by comedians, are based on shallow observations made by people who didn't necessarily have the most charitable view of millennials to begin with. Let's begin with one of the most common talking points. Millennials, again, read young people, are shallow and narcissistic. Look at the constantly updated social feeds full of pictures of their food and their own faces. Aside from the fact that plenty of Gen Xers and Boomers, and even some silent generation people, use the internet and social media, 72% of internet users aged between 50 and 65 are on Facebook. The fact of the matter is that millennials are more upbeat, more likely to self-identify as tolerant as any other generation, and are also just more tolerant than any other generation, and are confident, but defer and respect the experience of their elders. You know, the polling and the research shows that. It's on screen right now. Another key pejorative brought up over and over and over again is that the youths of today are just letting the world fly by and they're plain uninformed because they've got their faces glued to their phones at all times. And again, this is just plain untrue. Polling done by the Knight Foundation found that 88% of young adults access the news at least once a week, and that young people were 7 times less likely to share or post a fake news article during the 2016 election period. Now, that millennials were taught all through childhood not to trust everything they read online. How many times were you told not to use Wikipedia as a source because it could be edited by anyone? Now, that's an education that the eldest of our society didn't get. On to coddling. Everyone gets a participation trophy these days. Millennials just can't handle criticism in the workplace, or they just get upset, and we have to take care of their feelings. Well, Firstly, isn't it good to give feedback in a way that prioritizes the feelings and well-being of the person receiving it? An unhappy worker is an unproductive worker. If they hate you, they're not going to do what they want you to do. But that's not the point. David Brooks, the epitome of old man yells at cloud, wrote an article in April with the headline, "The Age of Coddling is Over," and spewed forth his baseless and boorish belief that the youngsters of today are being coddled by overprotective parents that have raised weak and sheltered children, pointing to higher rates of mental illness among the younger population as evidence that parents didn't teach their children to function in the world. Considering that a massive factor in the growth of mental health diagnosis across the globe is the massive uptick in people seeking treatment, this seems like Brooks's own bias against young people forming his insanely offensive belief that mental illness is caused by weakness. But apart from that, he also makes the point that due to the collective belief of safetyism, his dumb word, not mine, that young people haven't undergone any kind of hardship, and that's why they need to be coddled, which is fucking stupid. Come back to me when you've seen the global economy tank 3 times before you're 25. When you haven't lived in a nation that wasn't involved in global conflict and are watching the nations of the world devolve into fascist dictatorships and are dealing with a pandemic that could be very simply dealt with by paying everyone to stay home, but apparently it's okay if people die to keep numbers ticking up on a spreadsheet, and also watch the world slowly burn because people your age, specifically you, David, won't do anything about it. Millennials are the first generation who have a worse standard of living than their parents. That's a fact. Cut the young people some slack. Yeah, but you won't. Or at least the media machine designed to drive clicks for revenue will not, because millennial bashing brings people from both sides of the aisle to agree and disagree vehemently in the comments. But this video goes out to y'all in the comments who are fighting the good fight. And also anyone who's ever sat at the dinner table and listened to their grandfather, uncle, mother, gone to work and had their boss or their teacher spew forth some kind of rhetoric that you're lazy, or that you just don't care, or that you need coddling or a hug to accept good-natured criticism. Send them this. Or take the facts from this and tell them to them. I don't really want the hate.